Victoria 3 has come a really long way since its release a couple of years ago, and whilst the initial reception was not amazing because of the issues that the game had at the time, with the more recent patches from 1.5, 1.6, 1.7, we've seen some pretty decent military reworks, a lot of new flavor added, which in turn means that we had a lot more replayability. Now, what you guys might not know is that patch 1.8 is one of the biggest stepping stones for Victoria 3 because it's going to be revamping a lot of the basic mechanics of the game, with discrimination being reworked, political movement being reworked, how civil wars work. We have a new famine system and starvation system. Companies are getting reworked. How nationalization is going to be a little bit reworked as well. And we might even have, considering what they said in the more recent video they released on the official Victoria 3 channel, some changes for the Navy aspect and the military aspect, albeit not so much sure if that's going to come in 1.8, but it is definitely on the table. They do want to make some changes for military eventually. That being aside though, what we currently know is going to get changed for 1.8 is so massive that it's going to completely change the meta for all the game itself. Now, earlier in the development diaries for 1.8, they did mention that with update 1.9, they intend to have a larger update following closely on the heels of 1.8, but they will be delaying 1.9 all the way to next year. So this 1.8 update, which is coming soon, it's going to be a stepping stone towards 1.9, which itself is going to be a huge update. So to go through the 4 current dev diaries, I'm going to basically make a sum up of what exactly the dev diary is about. I'm not just going to read everything in here. Nationalization, you will be able to bulk nationalize your buildings if you like to. You don't need to do it one by one anymore. Added in 1.7, the privatization or nationalization of your buildings is honestly a massive deal. Basically, by going full on privatization early in the game, you can afford to grow 20 times faster your industrial output than you would be able to otherwise from the extra revenue that you get from selling those buildings. Then eventually in the later part of the campaign, you can nationalize again, steal back those buildings if you want to, depending on what kind of political process you want to be overtaken, right? Communism. So you'll be able to bulk nationalize from the building registry, which was also added in 1.7. This is what it looks over here. You click on nationalize filter buildings. It lists all the, in this case, British buildings that you can nationalize. You give compensation to the owners, and holy shit, that's 2.6 million. That's actually not so bad considering it's 14 buildings, right? You have up to 67 buildings that you can nationalize. I love this. The fact that you have a scroll so you can decide how many buildings you actually want to nationalize, just in case you don't have money to nationalize all of them, right? You also have the ability to nationalize buildings owned by either the Manor House, Financial District, Worker, or just all of them. So that's pretty cool because maybe you just want to target a specific demographic in your country to take their buildings, right? With 1.8, you're also going to have companies owning buildings. So that's something new. It's not going to be only Manor House, Financial Districts, worker owned and stuff like that. It's also going to be company owned. So this is done by giving a established company a headquarters building, and that's going to act as essentially a financial district or manor house, which in turn will be able to own other buildings. So when you establish a company, the headquarters of that company is going to be determined based on which state has the specific buildings that will affect that company the most. So as they give an example here, Friedrich Group, which affects steel guns artillery, will spawn in a state which has a lot of those particular buildings. And we see here the company itself, Friedrich Group, as the headquarters of the company in Westphalia in the case of their game. Once established, these companies will be able to invest in new building levels like financial districts or manor houses, so they work the same. They also use the investment pool as well. One thing that's different from manor houses and financial districts is that companies will prefer to invest locally. So if a company is built in Westphalia, it will prefer to invest in Westphalia before it starts investing in other states around it. Also, they only invest in buildings of their assigned type. So Friedrich Group will never build ranches, as they say here. Friedrich Group is primarily going to be investing in steel mills, artillery, and I think guns too might be a Friedrich Group interested in, which is nice because if you really want your private sector to focus on building specific buildings with the investment pool, then you establish a company that builds those specific buildings and you're set. You don't need to worry about the investment pool being used by stuff that you don't really want to have built in your country. I like this suggestion. It's not final, but they said that they are thinking about adding a new color to distinguish the ownership type further. I second this. A new color for ownership type is amazing. I hope they do this, honestly. This would be really good. It would be easier for us to realize who owns that particular building by just looking at the color, right? Also, if there's at least one level of a building owned by a company, we place an additional billboard showing the company's logo on that particular building. So you have here the billboards with the various company logos right next to that particular building. I also take note, there's a lot of things that they're not saying in this particular dev diary that you guys will see later once the patch is actually out, but suffice to say that what we see here is not final, and it's also gonna change based on your feedback. So do make sure you go on the forums themselves and give your feedback on whatever you like to see changed for Victoria 3. Next, we also have the political movement rework, which is honestly very, very important, so pay close attention for this one. Now, the way it stands right now in 1.7, when there is a political movement, they gather support and you eventually will be changing to another type of legislation with the help of that particular political movement. Now, what they want to do with 1.8 is they want to change political movements from temporary demands, so forcing you to temporarily change a specific legislation, into long-term ideological forces that can shape the political landscape of your country. Movements are no longer formed around enacting or preserving a single legislation. Instead, there's a wide variety of movement types, each with its own unique agenda and conditions for forming. And there's three categories of them. Ideological movement, which push a particular ideological agenda, so say communists or Democrats or whatever, and they don't want to just enact one legislation. They want to enact multiple legislations if that particular movement gets enough power. So for example, you can have movements such as abolitionists and suffragettes and national liberals. This would be political movement. Abolitionists, suffragettes obviously want to enforce banning slavery and enabling women's suffrage. Communists want to have a single political party, state-driven economy, and they will advocate for all of those particular legislations to change, not just for one. Now, there's also cultural movements. That's freaking huge, by the way, guys. Absolutely huge. So this is not about enacting legislation, but they advocate for the rights and privileges of a particular culture in a country. Their specific agenda is based on whether the culture is a primary culture or a minority culture, as well as the legal status of that particular culture in the country. So for example, a cultural minority of South Italians in North Italy would oppose enacting ethnostate, because obviously that would strip away their rights, but that also does not mean that they would necessarily agree to extend those rights to others, less accepted cultures. So what that means is South Italians, they don't want ethnostate because they lose their acceptance, but they also don't want racial segregation, which would accept other people. Okay? But what I'm saying is South Italians are clearly scumbags. That's what Paradox is trying to say anyway. Then we also have the third movement, which is a religious movement. So religious movements have been completely placed in their own category, and they're similar to cultural movements. We have here the screen for the pro-slavery movement in the US, which is comprised of Dixie Pops, who would have thought, and has a wide-reaching influence in multiple interest groups. So we see here 177,000 individuals support this movement. Most of them are a part of the armed forces, landowners, the clergy, and quite a few farmers as well, actually. They've also changed the support and radicalism for movements. So now the way it works is when it says 50% support, it actually means that half your country actually supports that particular movement, which is a massive deal. It's very, very straightforward now, percentage between 0 and 10% of your country, so you know how many people are backing it, how many are not, and you know if it's really something you need to be worried about or not. There's also two types of support. There's popular support and military support. This is the civilians and the military establishment, basically officers and enlisted personnel. For the popular support, it's pretty straightforward. Basically, if it says 100,000 people out of a million, that means there's 10% popular support because it's 10% of the population. However, for the military, it's a little bit more different based on the type of military unit, be it officers, soldiers, and they also mentioned that they want to add something different for generals as well. So generals might be a little bit more important, let's say, in the military support for political movements. Gaining support is basically the same. You have attraction weight for the political movements, which of course depends on the nature of the movement. Example of that is abolitionist movement will have more support for literate pops of certain professions, and it will attract fewer pops from religious professions, I guess. There's also going to be a system of initial enthusiasm for political movements that obviously dies down afterwards. This is basically a boost to make the movement appear and get some traction. And also they want to mention that pop support for movements will be significantly slower, so it's not going to happen overnight. You're going to need to get massive attraction weight in order to get people behind a specific movement. So it's going to be a little bit more of a slow play in 1.8, but that's actually a good thing because the way that it works right now, it's really exploitable in a lot of cases. We have here the pro-Turkish cultural movement in Ottoman Empire seeks that the Turks remain at the top of Ottoman society and have a fairly strong base of support in the military. Well, who would have thought? This is the Turkish moral majority having 15 support. That's 148,000 from individuals and 26,000 servicemen officers. Look at the difference here. So we see the popular support, despite having 7 times more civilians, it has less importance compared to the military class. So 1% support from 140,000 and 15 support from 26,000. That is a massive difference. That means in 1.8, you really want to have the military backing you at all times. So again, Paradox reiterates that the movements will champion several ideologies, of course, and there's different ways through which they push some ideologies. Some of them are direct action. There's also going to be 4 levels of movement radicalism. The first one, as you would imagine, the easiest is passive. Movements with low radicalism are passive. They have no direct effect and will only indirectly influence interest groups, so you don't really need to worry about them too much. Then we have agitating stage. They will influence the enactment chances of laws that they support or oppose. So if you have, for example, a political movement for abolitionism, right? You want to abolish slavery, and you're enacting a legislation that goes against that particular legislation somehow, right? Or that particular ideology somehow, then you're going to have less chance of enacting that particular legislation because of the agitating political movement for abolition. Third stage is protesting. Protesting movements will have a greater impact on the enactment chance of their supported and opposed laws, but also steadily turn their supporters into radicals. So protesting phase for political movements means you're going to get a success chance if you enact legislation that supports them, but you're also going to radicalize your pop. So if you don't enact those legislations, they're going to get more and more radicalized, and they're going to get to the highest stage, which is the rioting stage, which is basically full-on civil war. This is how you unite a civil war. If they reach the rioting stage, a political movement will begin the civil war. They've also changed it how choosing a new interest group leader works. So previously, as you guys know, you used to all go for corn laws, get market liberal, pass homesteading, and so on. Now it's a little bit different because leader ideologies can only be picked from either a set basic ideology inherent to the interest group or from one of the movements that is influencing the interest group, with movement ideology tending to have stronger ways to the basic one. That means you cannot just put a interest group leader that you want. It has to be something that aligns with the policies of the interest group, or that there is enough support because of a movement within that particular interest group, which also means that ideology selection can also be predicted and displayed so that you can have an educated guess about the ways the political winds are blowing in the interest groups. That's good. Yeah, I like that. So essentially, this does create factions from the various movements within your interest groups. So they further divide the interest groups, all of which are competing to install a leader and take control of the interest group for as long as the leader remains in power. For example, the evangelicals here are torn between pro and anti-slavery movement. The next leader of evangelicals may come down on either side of the issue. So there's movements against slavery and pro-slavery, and whenever the next leader is going to be selected, it's either going to be really bad or really good for you. Depends on what kind of country you want to have, really. Jacksonian Democrat 45%, abolitionist 30%, traditionalist 15%, moderate 7%, slaver 2%. So that adds up to 100% leader ideology chances. Jackson Democrat, not really the greatest, but I guess better than traditionalists, right? Now, agitators are pretty much the same as they were before. They appear and they start or join political movements, can also be exiled or invited still, but the difference is that now they increase the pop attraction for that movement rather than actually increase the size of the movement itself. What they do is they get more people to join that movement essentially, and the people themselves are the ones that count towards the actual support. Another major rework is how discrimination works as of 1.8, and this is a freaking huge deal. I actually think that this is probably one of the most W takes ever from Victoria 3 team, and definitely really needed a proper rework for the discrimination system. First off, it's not called discrimination anymore, it's called acceptance system, okay? So people get accepted based on some different parameters. Each pops will be accepted between 0 and 100, so they can be more or less accepted, with obviously your primary culture being 100 accepted, and then working your way down based on a few things such as culture, cultural trait, heritage and cultural trait, and primary culture. The country's law is still the thing that determines the acceptance level. So we have here, for example, national supremacy. If you are the primary culture, you are 100% accepted. If you share the cultural and heritage trait, then you are 75% accepted. So that means if you, for example, have national supremacy and you're South German in Prussia, you will be 75% accepted because you both have the European heritage, but you also have the cultural trait of Germanophobe or whatever it's called, I forgot. If you are Polish, you're 50% accepted because you share the European heritage, but you're not part of the Germanic speaking peoples, and so on. If you're African, you're probably 0 accepted, I guess. The acceptance value actually determines which acceptance status a population has, and there's 5 possible statuses ranging from full acceptance to violent hostility, which will be used in order to apply consequences to pops in question. So we have here, for example, and this is a work in progress image by the way, some of the modifiers. Depending on your acceptance level, you will be allowed to work in military buildings, government buildings, the wage amount that you get, voting right, population, political strength. So in essence, acceptance determines everything. It means that if you're not accepted, if you're on the 5th level, which is violent hostility, you likely will not be able to work in military buildings, you're not going to be able to work in government buildings, you're going to get a lower wage, you're going to get less qualifications, and so on, while somebody that's full accepted is going to have all the privileges of a full acceptance pop. I love this. I have to say this is the biggest W so far in my opinion, because it's not any longer a flat, oh, you're accepted or you're not accepted. Having different levels means that you could have Polish people that maybe they're 50% accepted, that they can work in military buildings, so you don't need to rely only on your primary accepted pops to work in military buildings like you kind of have to do in 1.7 as it stands, and so on, right? It's such a good freaking feature in my opinion. Oh, actually we see the levels here: open prejudice acceptance status, second-rate citizen status, full acceptance status. So this particular legislation, I'm going to go ahead and guess that this is national supremacy. It allows essentially full acceptance, second-rate citizens, and open prejudice citizens to work in government buildings, military buildings, etc, etc. Nice. Another thing that determines pop's acceptance is the age of the pop's cultural community in their state. An immigrant pop that is fresh off the boat will not be as accepted as that of another culture which has been there for 30 years already. No matter what your laws say, your pops will need some time to get used to the new faces in their neighborhood. Eventually, your new arrivals will reach acceptance status with which the laws have determined for them. Oh, that is so cool, man. So we have here an example: Siberians in Ulster. 50 national acceptance of Siberian culture because it is European heritage, I guess. But local acceptance is minus 21. So they only have 29 acceptance actually, and this is decaying. In 7 years they're gonna have 50 acceptance. So that is so cool. After a population migrates, even if they are German, so you have people migrating, say for example from Saxony to Westphalia, right? Because they're North Germans both, then you get 100 acceptance, but you get minus, I don't know, 21 or 25 or whatever, until the people living in that area with them become accustomed to them. So they're gonna have 75 acceptance until that particular time has passed. That is such a good feature. That is really such a good feature. This can be changed by enacting more progressive laws. So for example, ethnostate doesn't grant any bonus to cultures that share non-heritage cultures trait with your primary culture, but natural supremacy does give 25 acceptance if you do. Interesting. Also, if you pass multiculturalism, it still will take a period of time for your pops to accept other pops. It's not an instant sort of thing. So as of 1.8, pops will be able to assimilate or convert to any culture or religion that would provide them with a higher acceptance value, even if it is not the primary culture or state religion. So they could come to your country, but they could convert to another type of culture For example, if their current acceptance is 25 and the minimum assimilation value difference from the citizenship law is defined at 50, their target culture acceptance would need to be 75 or higher in order for them to assimilate. Also, assimilation may be forbidden by law. Under all laws, it is currently not allowed for members of the lower status to assimilate at all. Pops of the higher status also do not assimilate in the current setup, as they already possess enough rights and privileges to enjoy a good life. So we have here the society screen, as it's called. There's multiple levels of acceptance of pops in Great Britain. So this particular pops here will slowly work their way towards the highest acceptance level. And we see here the permissions. It is allowed assimilation for pops in the cultural erasure acceptance status, which is the one that they are in right now. Now we also have a second dev diary explaining in more detail civil wars and political movement radicalism. So I'm going to go through this and not repeat any of the stuff we talked about in the previous dev diary. Most important here, civil wars are all started by radical movements, including secessionists. So that means the previous system of just a different culture having high turmoil is gone. Oh my freaking hallelujah. No more 1,000 different rebellions in every single separate province because of high turmoil. Great freaking news. I really love this. Really, really like this. So the only civil war you can have now is revolution or secession. That's it. So it's going to take a lot, and I mean a lot of small individual little pops around Africa to rebel into an actual secession. Keep that in mind. That being said, cultural minority movements will always try to secede if they can. Royalist movements will always launch a revolution if they can, but might secede under very specific circumstances, okay? Slavery movements will launch revolutions, and religious movements will launch revolutions. And now, whether they can start a civil war or not is going to depend on their radicalism. There also needs to be at least one interest group supporting that particular movement or revolution, or it doesn't happen, no matter how big it is, okay? So now that one interest group that supports the revolution has to be influenced by the movement, must be angry, so that means minus what, 20 relations, minus 20 approval, and must at least somehow be ideologically aligned with the movement. So even if the interest group is somehow influenced by the anti-slavery movement, if they have pro-slavery ideology, they still might not actually trigger the civil war. That being said, secessions do not always pull in interest groups, so that only applies for revolutions. Okay, so we see here the pro-slavery movement is a revolution. It is rioting a radicalism level, which is the 4th level. Remember that, that's the highest level, and it has relevant support, which is 12%. Now, which states become a part of the revolution has been completely changed. It depends on the type and the support of the movement, as well as where the support comes from. So where those pops are located and whether they are a majority in that particular state. For example, a movement with the high military support will tend to get more of the states with barracks, naval bases, whilst a movement backed by a large population, the population will gain a greater share of states overall. In other words, if you stack all the barracks in the capital and then proceed to anger the military, then the capital is likely to be on the other side of the war. Oh my god. Okay, so no more capital exploits as of 1.8, guys. Unincorporated states are also now able to take sides, so the revolutions aren't just a concern in the metropole anymore. Oh boy. Example, here we have the Lowland Uprising, which includes basically all of the Scottish areas, and also we have the famine, starvation, and harvest conditions dev diary. This is also huge because it completely changes the dynamic of how exactly food impacts your population. You're no longer going to be able to have massive shortages of food because that's actually going to affect your population a lot now, and you can even have famines which kill off a huge amount of your pops, which is really not great unless you want to intentionally do it, which is kind of why I'm thinking of a very specific pressure run in 1.8. I'm not gonna elaborate too much on it, if you know what I mean. So the way that the currently starvation works in 1.7, because we do have starvation, is when the standard of living drops below 5, people start increasing the mortality, so they start dying off. That's not a great system because first off, it's not about how much food you have, it's about the goods available and how much they cost for the pops that determines starvation, which doesn't make too much sense. So they've reworked that completely for 1.8. So they've added now a starvation, famine, and harvest condition conditions as 3 new features in essence, and well, rework the way it worked before. Starvation is dynamic. I'm a little bit concerned as to why this man is making dynamic with stars here about starvation. That's weird. In 1.8, all pops are going to have a metric for food security, which determines how much access populations have to sufficient and nutritious food. If a pop's food security gets too low, it will first be considered to be in a state of mild starvation, where in that state, pops will start getting some penalties to the birth rate and mortality. If food security drops even lower, the status changes to severe starvation, where the pop's population starts decreasing fast. To be clear, both mild and severe starvation penalties get progressively worse as food security drops, so it's not a hard threshold where suddenly the full effects are applied. So basically, it's a line. The lower you go on that food line or food security line, the more people are going to get in trouble and start dying off a lot. They're introducing shortages for goods in the basic food pop need category, and they're also adding a shortage value to the basic food pop need itself. This is calculated essentially as the average shortage value for the goods and the pop need weighed over how much pops are actually consuming each good. So if 90% of your pop's food consumption is grain and 10% is fish, a grain shortage will have a much bigger impact than a fish shortage. Different pops are going to be eating different stuff. I'm assuming that Swedes are going to eat 100% fish, but that's aside from the point. So take note, they're only adding shortages for basic food, not for the other needs that the pops have, like clothes and stuff like that. You're going to have a food security tab added to the market screen from now on, with the ability to see if there's any ongoing famines, and you can see the basic food pop needs for all countries or for all states. You see here we got for the Portuguese a little bit of an unbalance when it comes down to grain, and we see how many people have no starvation, how many have mild starvation, and how many have severe starvation. We also have the harvest conditions, optimal sunlight, extreme winds, drought. So what exactly is food security? So food security is a metric that determines whether a pop is starving and how strong the effect of that starvation is. It goes from 0 to 100%, where 0% of the pop is in a state of severe starvation and 100% of the pop have full and easy access to all the food it requires. 0 bad, 100% good base. The metrics for determining said food security is how much of the food pop need is in shortage, as well as how much money the pop is spending on basic food. At different wealth levels, pops need to buy different amounts of goods from a number of needs. We have an example here. A population that is wealth 9 needs to consume goods to cover their simple clothing, crude item, basic food, heating, intoxicants, etc. Right? So the value of what they need is at the base price 314. After considering market availability, food is actually very expensive. Pop is spending 220 on food, which is 70% of their income is going on food. You see here for the lavished rich population capitalists in France, they have food security severe. 1% currently food security. Why is that? I don't know. Must be some sort of starvation happening in Auvergne-Limousin. They have a buy order 976 and sell order of 0. Severe starvation, 62% birth rate reduction and 39% mortality. That is a recipe for disaster. If your food security is 1%, your pops is going to completely get wiped out. Oh my god, I'm going to use that a lot. I just realized. Am I a horrible person? Maybe, but shut up, okay? As you would expect, starvation is going to be affecting primarily the poor pops, but not limited to. Rich pops can get affected by it also, of course. Famine is basically a political classification that comes up when enough population are suffering from starvation. So what they check is how many pops are starving in a particular state and how many of them are suffering from severe starvation in that state. So when famine happens in a state, it acts as a starting point for narrative content surrounding that famine and how to deal with it. For instance, I'm guessing you're going to get some events about that particular famine in that particular state. Is what that means. Lastly but not least, the harvest conditions affect how much throughput you're going to be getting. So basically how much food you're going to be able to harvest from that particular state. This is what it looks like when you have torrential rain in around Zealand. It gives infrastructure reduction, agriculture throughput, etc. throughput reduction. You can see on the map itself, actually, this is what drought looks like when there's basically no water. It actually shows on the map, and the same province, but now you actually don't have drought anymore. So I like that. I like that you literally see on the map when an actual state is getting affected, and also you see floods as well. Look at that. That is so freaking cool. It can affect a smaller or a larger area, and it can happen for a longer or a shorter period as well, be it drought, torrential rains, floods, etc. And this is the map also we see here. We got drought over there. This is torrential rains, rains again, rains, freezing in the north. This is some sort of freezing in the north as well. Emergency relief has been changed. Apparently, it now gives 50% tax collection reduction, but it gives food security, infrastructure, and market access price impact. That is pretty cool to see, actually. National Guard also has been changed. So drought, flood, wildfire, and extreme winds, harvest conditions impact have been reduced per level, so you can get up to minus 25% reduction at level 5 National Guard. Well, actually, you can only have up to level 3 National Guard, right? That's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this dev diary. I really love to see what's happening with the Victoria 3, and I'm really hyped for 1.8 patch. Hope you guys are too. Love you all, and I'll see you in the next one.